In a black and white photograph taken in November of 1918, a heavy-set man in his early 70s stands in the courtyard of a modest hunting lodge near Salzburg, no longer a king, though the newspapers in Munich had not quite worked out what to call him yet. His name was Ludwig, and 8 days earlier he had ruled Bavaria, the third largest state in the German Empire, a kingdom that had outlasted Napoleon, outlasted Bismarck's unification of Germany, and had been governed by his family, the House of Wittelsbach, for 738 years. On the 13th of November, he signed a single sheet of paper releasing his officials and soldiers from their oaths of loyalty. He never used the word abdicate. He did not need to. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The men who read the document in Munich understood exactly what it meant, and by that afternoon, Bavaria was a republic. King Ludwig III was a private citizen, and the oldest continuously ruling royal house in Europe had lost its throne within the span of a single week. This is the story of what happened to that family in the 60 years that followed. Not the week of the collapse itself, but the wandering exile of an old king who died in a borrowed castle, the concentration camps that swallowed his grandchildren a generation later, and the strange, quiet path by which the House of Wittelsbach survived all of it, and remarkably, is still living today inside the palace it once ruled from. To understand what was lost in November of 1918, you have to understand what the Wittelsbachs had actually built. They were not a family that had seized Bavaria in a single generation the way some royal houses did. Their rule stretched back to 1180, when Duke Otto of Wittelsbach was granted the duchy by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, and from that point forward, through the Reformation, the 30 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, and the unification of Germany under Prussia, a Wittelsbach had always sat on the Bavarian throne. By the time Ludwig III came to power, the family had produced electors, dukes, and kings, and had even placed one of its own, Charles VII, briefly on the throne of the Holy Roman Empire itself in the 18th century. They had built the Munich residence into one of the great palace complexes of Europe, filled Nymphenburg with formal gardens modeled on Versailles, and under the eccentric King Ludwig II, Ludwig III's own cousin once removed, they had raised Neuschwanstein above the Bavarian Alps, a castle so theatrical it would later become the model for a Disney logo, though the king who built it drowned under mysterious circumstances in a lake before it was even finished, having already been declared unfit to rule. Ludwig III himself had not expected to be king. He came to the throne only because his cousin, King Otto, had been declared mentally unfit to rule in 1886 after a long and well-documented decline, and had spent nearly 3 decades as a figurehead monarch confined to Fürstenried Palace, while Ludwig's own father, Prince Regent Luitpold, actually governed the country in his place. When Luitpold died in 1912, his son continued as regent for another year before the Bavarian parliament, tired of maintaining the fiction of a king who could not function, passed a law permitting Ludwig to formally depose his own cousin and take the crown himself. He was crowned in November of 1913, a solidly built farmer's king who was more comfortable inspecting agricultural exhibitions than attending court balls, popular with ordinary Bavarians precisely because he seemed so unglamorous. He had less than 5 years to enjoy any of it. The First World War arrived within 9 months of his coronation, and it consumed everything the dynasty had left. Bavaria sent its young men into the trenches alongside the rest of the German Empire, and Ludwig's own son, Crown Prince Ruprecht, commanded an entire army group on the Western Front, one of the very few reigning or future European monarchs to hold genuine battlefield command, rather than a purely ceremonial post. Ruprecht was, by most accounts, a capable and thoughtful general, respected even by some of the British officers who fought against him, and he grew increasingly convinced as the war dragged into its 3rd and 4th years that Germany could not win it and should seek a negotiated peace before the entire continent bled itself white. Nobody in Berlin listened to him. The High Command kept gambling on offensives that never quite broke through, and by the autumn of 1918, with the German army collapsing on the Western Front and food shortages gutting the cities at home, the political structure of the entire empire began to buckle all at once. The city by city, garrison by garrison, as sailors mutinied at the naval bases in the north, and workers' councils began forming in factories that, only a few years earlier, had been turning out uniforms and artillery shells for a king who still believed the war could somehow be won. In Bavaria specifically, a socialist journalist named Kurt Eisner organized a march through Munich on the night of the 7th of November, and by the following morning he had declared Bavaria a free state from the balcony of a beer hall, ending the monarchy, before Ludwig had even fully understood what was happening in his own capital. Ludwig fled the Munich residence with his family that same night, taking refuge first at Anef Palace near Salzburg, in what he genuinely believed was a temporary arrangement until the situation calmed. It never calmed. 6 days later, from that borrowed palace in Austria, he signed the paper that ended 7 centuries of Wittelsbach rule, choosing careful legal language over a formal abdication, as though the distinction might somehow preserve some sliver of the throne for later. It did not. What followed for the old king was not the dignified retirement he might have imagined for himself. His wife, Queen Maria Theresa, had been at his side through the frantic flight from Munich, and the couple settled at Wildenwart Castle in the Bavarian countryside, hoping to live quietly, as private citizens under the new republic that had just dethroned them. She died there in February of 1919, only 3 months after the abdication, worn down by the stress of the collapse and the sudden loss of everything she had known for half a century. Ludwig had barely buried her when Kurt Eisner himself was assassinated on the streets of Munich by a young nationalist aristocrat, and the political chaos that followed, briefly bringing a Soviet-style council republic to power in the Bavarian capital, convinced the frightened former king that he might be a target too. He fled again, this time in genuine fear for his life, moving from Hungary to Liechtenstein and finally to Switzerland before cautiously returning to Wildenwart in the spring of 1920. He lived there for a little over a year, an old man alone in a country house, before deciding in the autumn of 1921 to travel to a family property at Sarvar in Hungary. He never made the return trip. On the 18th of October 1921, Ludwig III, the last king of Bavaria, died at Sarvar Castle at the age of 76, a monarch who had reigned for barely 5 years and spent nearly 3 of them either fighting a war or fleeing his own country. His body was brought back to Munich alongside that of his wife, and despite fears within the new Republican government that a state funeral might spark a monarchist uprising, roughly 100,000 people lined the streets to watch the funeral procession pass. He was buried in the crypt of the Frauenkirche, the great twin-towered cathedral at the heart of the city his family had ruled for over 7 centuries, and his son Ruprecht, standing over the coffin, made a quiet and deliberate choice that would define the rest of the family's approach to the century ahead. He would not try to reclaim the throne by force, would not organize a coup or an uprising the way some monarchist officers were already urging him to do. He would simply wait, hold his title privately, and see what history decided to do with his family instead. Ruprecht became head of the House of Wittelsbach at the moment of his father's death, and he inherited a genuinely strange position, both enormously respected and utterly powerless. He was, in the eyes of monarchists across Bavaria and much of southern Germany, the rightful king in exile, a title he never formally renounced for the rest of his life, and one that appeared on his personal stationery until his death decades later. But he was also, under the new Weimar Republic, simply a private citizen with an enormous amount of property, a well-known name, and no political power to speak of. In 1923, his family reached a settlement with the Bavarian state that would shape the Wittelsbachs' fortunes for the rest of the century. The agreement created something called the Wittelsbacher Ausgleichsfonds, a compensation fund that formally transferred ownership of certain former royal residences, including the fairy tale castle of Neuschwanstein built by his uncle, to the Bavarian government, while allowing the family to retain a significant art collection, several remaining palaces, and a steady income drawn from the fund itself. It was, in effect, a peaceful and reasonably generous divorce between a dynasty and the state it had once ruled, negotiated across a conference table rather than fought over in the streets, and it meant that even without a throne, the Wittelsbachs would remain one of the wealthiest and most visible families in Bavaria for generations to come. The early 1920s, in fact, came closer to a genuine restoration than most people realize today. Bavaria in that period was governed by a deeply conservative administration under a monarchist-leaning state commissioner named Gustav von Kahr, and rumors swirled constantly through Munich that Kahr's government was quietly preparing the ground for Ruprecht's return to some kind of throne, whether as a full constitutional monarch or as a figurehead within a more authoritarian Bavarian state that would break away from Berlin entirely. It was into this exact atmosphere of monarchist scheming and general political chaos that a little-known Austrian agitator named Adolf Hitler staged his first attempt to seize power, the failed beer hall putsch of November 1923, in which Hitler and his followers tried to hijack a public meeting addressed by Kahr himself and use it as the launching point for a march on Berlin. Ruprecht, watching from a careful distance, wanted nothing to do with either the putsch or the movement behind it, and he made his distaste for Hitler clear to Kahr's government in the days that followed, reportedly warning that any future association between the Wittelsbach name and this particular agitator would be a serious mistake for Bavaria to make. It was advice that history would prove entirely correct, though it would take another decade and a half, and the near destruction of his own family, before the full weight of that warning finally landed. Ruprecht married for a second time in April of 1921 to Princess Antonia of Luxembourg, a young woman more than 30 years his junior, and herself the daughter of a Grand Duke who had ruled a country that had also, in its own smaller way, been swept up in the political earthquakes following the war. The couple settled into what looked, for a decade and a half, like a comfortable and dignified private life split between a wing of the residens, Wildenwart, and the family's various country estates. They had 6 children together, 4 daughters and 2 sons, and by most contemporary accounts it was a genuinely happy household, filled with the kind of ordinary domestic routine that Ruprecht, after 2 decades of court ceremony and battlefield command, seemed almost relieved to settle into. Visitors who spent time with the family in these years described a household that felt almost deliberately ordinary, children doing schoolwork at a kitchen table in a wing of a palace, Ruprecht himself more likely to be found reading military history in a modest study than presiding over any kind of court. It was, by the standards of what had come before and what was about to come after, the calmest stretch the Wittelsbachs would know for the rest of the century. None of them could have known what was waiting for the family in the next war, or how close the entire household would come to being destroyed by it. Adolf Hitler's rise to power in the early 1930s put Ruprecht in an immediately dangerous position, though it took years for the danger to become fully clear even to the family itself. Ruprecht had never hidden his contempt for the Nazi movement. He viewed Hitler as a vulgar demagogue leading Germany toward catastrophe, and he made no secret, at least among his own circle, of his monarchist convictions, or his belief that a restored, constitutional Wittelsbach throne would have been a far better guardian of Bavaria than the National Socialist state that had actually seized it. The Nazi Party, for its part, made periodic attempts to court him anyway, hoping that his prestige among conservative and Catholic Bavarians might be useful in legitimizing the regime, and periodic attempts to intimidate him when the courting inevitably failed. Ruprecht was reported, in later British diplomatic accounts, to have told King George V directly that he remained convinced the Führer was insane, a comment that would have been extraordinarily dangerous had it become widely known inside Germany itself. By 1939, with war on the horizon and Ruprecht increasingly outspoken in private about his loathing of the regime, the family judged it safer to leave the country entirely. They accepted an invitation from King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy and relocated first to Florence, and then, as Italy itself grew less stable and more entangled with Berlin, onward to Hungary, settling at the family's castle in Sarvar, the very same estate where old King Ludwig had died nearly 2 decades earlier. For a while it seemed like a reasonable arrangement, a deposed royal family living quietly on its own property in a country still nominally independent of direct German control. It would not stay that way for long. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The turning point came in July of 1944, when a group of German army officers attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler with a bomb hidden in a briefcase at his eastern headquarters in East Prussia. The plot failed, Hitler survived with only minor injuries, and the Gestapo launched a sweeping campaign of retribution against anyone even loosely connected to Germany's old aristocratic and military establishment, a policy the Nazis had already used before under the name Sippenhaft, which punished entire families for the suspected disloyalty of a single member, regardless of whether the rest of the family had any knowledge of the plot at all. Ruprecht had never taken part in the July conspiracy and had no direct connection to the officers behind it, but his years of open contempt for the regime, combined with the family's known contacts among British and Italian royalty, made him exactly the kind of figure the Gestapo wanted removed from circulation. When Germany occupied Hungary in the autumn of 1944, following its former allies' attempts to negotiate a separate peace with the Soviets, Nazi forces moved almost immediately to arrest him. Ruprecht, warned just in time by sympathetic contacts, went into hiding in Italy and evaded capture for the rest of the war, spending months moving between safe houses while sick with an illness that left him bedridden for weeks at a stretch, unaware of what was happening to the family he had left behind. His wife and children had no such warning and no such escape. On Hitler's personal order, Princess Antonia and her children, along with Ruprecht's adult son and stepchildren from his first marriage and their own young families, were seized by the Gestapo in Hungary and placed under arrest as a single unit, regardless of age. What followed was months of imprisonment that moved the family through some of the most notorious sites of the entire Nazi camp system. Antonia contracted typhus during the early stages of her captivity and was hospitalized under armed guard in Innsbruck, too ill even to be moved for several weeks. Once she had recovered enough to travel, she was transferred to Sachsenhausen concentration camp north of Berlin, where several of her adult children were already being held in a section reserved for so-called prominent prisoners. As Soviet forces advanced from the east in early 1945, the prisoners were moved again, this time to Flossenbürg concentration camp in Bavaria, where Antonia was repeatedly interrogated and, according to later accounts from surviving family members, physically tortured by her captors, who demanded again and again to know where her husband was hiding. She never told them, even as her weight fell and her health, already weakened by the earlier bout of typhus and by the conditions of the camp itself, continued to collapse week after week, with no medical care beyond what fellow prisoners could quietly offer her. From Flossenbürg, the family was moved a final time, in the last chaotic weeks of the war, to Dachau, the camp on the outskirts of Munich that had become one of the central hubs of the entire Nazi prison system, and it was there, on the 30th of April 1945, that soldiers of the United States Army finally liberated the camp, and with it, the surviving members of the Wittelsbach family being held inside. By the time she was found, Princess Antonia weighed under 80 pounds. Her brother-in-law took her back to Luxembourg to begin a slow and painful physical recovery, and her daughters were reunited with her within weeks, as the war in Europe finally staggered to its end. The Wittelsbachs were, in a grim sense, not alone in this particular ordeal. The camps holding them also held a small, scattered group of other so-called prominent prisoners, relatives of foreign royals, resistance sympathizers, and captured military officers whom the Nazi leadership judged too valuable or too useful as future hostages to simply execute outright. It was among exactly this category that the Wittelsbach women and children were classified, which likely explains why, unlike millions of others who passed through the same gates, any of them survived at all. Ruprecht, still hiding in Italy and unaware for months of what had actually happened to his own wife and children, learned the full details of their imprisonment only after the liberation, piecing together the story from fragments passed along by Red Cross workers and returning family members. Antonia survived 9 more years, but according to those who knew her best, she never fully recovered from what had been done to her body in those camps, and she made a private vow, one she kept without exception for the rest of her life, never to set foot in Germany again, not even to see her own husband's family estates. She died in Switzerland in 1954, in exile from a country that had, in a strange and bitter symmetry, become her home twice over, and then rejected her twice, first when the monarchy fell, and again, far more violently, when the Nazis came for her family. She was 54 years old. Ruprecht returned to Bavaria after the war and spent his final decade doing something almost nobody would have expected from a man who had lost a throne, watched his wife's health destroyed, and nearly lost his entire family to the century's worst regime. He rebuilt. He founded a charitable trust dedicated to the reconstruction of Würzburg, a city that had been almost entirely flattened by a single night of Allied firebombing in the final months of the war, and he used what remained of the family's resources and connections to fund housing for residents left homeless by the destruction, working alongside city officials who had, only a few years earlier, lived under the very regime that had imprisoned his family. He never reclaimed a crown, never demanded a formal apology from the state that had once tried to erase his family, and by the 1950s almost nobody in Bavaria seriously expected the monarchy to return in any form, but he spent his last years as something closer to a beloved elder statesman than a bitter or resentful pretender, respected across the political spectrum for his wartime opposition to Hitler and his quiet, practical post-war philanthropy. He died in Munich in August of 1955 at the age of 86, and he was buried in the crypt of the Theatinerkirche, near the resting place of his own ancestors, and eventually near his first wife and eldest son, having lived through the independent kingdom of Bavaria, the German Empire, the Weimar Republic, the Nazi dictatorship, and the founding of the new West German state, outlasting every single political system that had ever tried to define him. The headship of the family passed to Ruprecht's eldest surviving son from his first marriage, Albrecht, who had himself endured a version of the Sippenhaft imprisonment as a young man alongside his stepmother and half-siblings, having been swept up in the same 1944 arrests, despite belonging to an entirely different branch of the family tree, one that had already been living apart from Ruprecht's second household for years. Albrecht spent the post-war decades, much as his father had, managing the family's remaining estates and the Ausgleichsfonds settlement, staying almost entirely out of active politics, and slowly rebuilding a version of Wittelsbach life that had nothing to do with ruling and everything to do with preservation, quiet philanthropy, and dynastic continuity for its own sake. He rarely gave interviews, avoided the kind of public monarchist rhetoric his father had tolerated in the 1920s, and by most accounts treated the family's remaining wealth less as a private fortune and more as a trust he happened to be managing on behalf of Bavarian culture as a whole, funding restorations, loaning artwork to museums, and generally behaving less like a deposed king's son and more like the director of a very old, very well-endowed cultural foundation. He died in 1996, and the headship passed to his son Franz, born in Munich in 1933, who had lived through the same wartime ordeal as a small child, arrested alongside his grandmother Antonia and the rest of the family in Hungary, and held in the same camps at Sachsenhausen and Dachau, before being liberated by American troops at 11 years old, an experience he would describe decades later, with characteristic understatement, as simply the family's darkest chapter. Franz grew up to become a respected collector and patron of modern art, studied business at the universities of Munich and Zurich, and settled permanently into Nymphenburg Palace on the outskirts of Munich, the same sprawling Baroque residence where generations of Wittelsbach kings had once spent their summers surrounded by formal gardens and canals. He never married, and in 2021, in his late 80s, he became the first head of a major European royal house to publicly acknowledge a same-sex partner, a physician named Thomas Greinwald, with whom he had quietly shared his life since 1980, without ever making the relationship public until an official portrait finally confirmed it. Under the family's succession rules, which trace their logic back centuries into old Bavarian dynastic law and still favor male heirs, the headship is set to pass on Franz's death to his younger brother Max, who has 5 daughters but no sons, and from Max onward to a cousin's line descended from Prince Luitpold, ensuring that the family name, if not the throne itself, continues into a 5th century since Duke Otto first received the duchy from an emperor who has been dead for 800 years. Franz's younger brother Max, born in 1937, took a somewhat different path than his more reserved sibling. He married Countess Elizabeth Douglas in 1967, and together they raised 5 daughters, none of whom can inherit the Wittelsbach headship itself under the family's centuries-old succession rules, though one of them, Sophie, went on to become hereditary Princess of Liechtenstein through her own marriage, carrying a thread of the Wittelsbach bloodline into yet another surviving European dynasty a few hundred kilometers to the west, one more small proof that even a family stripped of its throne can still, quietly, marry its way back into the fabric of European royalty. In July of 2023, the extended family gathered publicly for the wedding of Prince Ludwig of Bavaria, Max's grandson and third in line to the Wittelsbach headship, an event that drew royal guests from across Europe and gave ordinary Bavarians a rare glimpse of a family that, despite owning some of the most photographed buildings in the country, generally prefers to stay well out of the spotlight. It was at that same wedding that Franz and Thomas Greinwald appeared together in public as a couple for the first time, a small, quietly handled moment that nonetheless made headlines across Germany and beyond, a century removed from the world of Ludwig III, in which such an announcement from a reigning head of a royal house would have been unthinkable. Today, the House of Wittelsbach occupies a strange and, in its own quiet way, remarkably successful place in modern Bavarian life. The family that once ruled from the Munich residence now largely funds and oversees the museums and cultural collections that occupy it, through the same Ausgleichsfonds settlement negotiated back in 1923, sitting on the board of directors of a foundation most tourists walking through Munich have never even heard of. Franz still lives at Nymphenburg, welcoming scholars and researchers into a private wing of a palace that visitors tour by the millions every year, without necessarily grasping that its former royal family still lives there, sharing the same grounds as the tour groups and the wedding photographers. The castles the state took over in that original 1923 settlement, including Neuschwanstein, have become some of the most visited tourist sites on Earth, generating enormous revenue for the very government that ended the Wittelsbach monarchy, while the family that built them lives on quietly a few kilometers away, no longer sovereign, but never entirely dispossessed either. It is a strikingly different outcome from so many of the other great fallen dynasties of the 20th century. There was no firing squad here, no bullet in a cellar, no fortune buried at a border crossing and never recovered. There was instead a slow, almost bureaucratic negotiation with the state that replaced them, followed by 12 brutal years in which the family's survival was never remotely guaranteed, followed by another 80 years of careful, deliberate, and largely unglamorous rebuilding, one foundation and one settlement at a time. What makes the story worth telling is not simply that the Wittelsbachs survived, but the particular shape their survival took. Ludwig III died believing he had failed his family and his country, an old man mourning a wife in a borrowed castle, deposed without ever having formally used the word for it. 2 decades later, his own grandchildren and his son's second wife were dragged through the worst machinery the 20th century ever built, imprisoned not for anything they had done, but for who they happened to be related to, and they emerged from it with a matriarch who weighed less than 80 pounds and who could never again bring herself to cross a border she had once ruled beside. And yet, within a single generation of that horror, the same family was funding housing for bombed-out war refugees in Würzburg, and within 2 generations more, its head was living openly and comfortably among the Bavarian public, as a private citizen with a foundation, a partner, and a palace full of art he had spent a lifetime collecting, rather than inheriting by conquest. There is something almost deliberately unspectacular about how the Wittelsbachs handled every turning point along the way. No last stand, no dramatic reversal, no headline-grabbing declaration of a restored kingdom. Just a family that kept negotiating, kept surviving, and kept quietly stitching itself back together every single time the century tried to tear it apart, from a beer hall putsch it wanted no part of, to a concentration camp it never should have been sent to in the first place. 738 years of rule ended in a single week in November of 1918. But the family itself did not end with it. It simply stopped being a monarchy and became something else entirely, a name, a foundation, a set of palaces open to the public, and a quiet, ongoing presence in the very city its ancestors had governed since the days of Frederick Barbarossa. Somewhere in Nymphenburg Palace tonight, in a private wing most of the tourists walking the gardens outside will never see or even think to look for, that presence continues, unbroken, into a 9th decade since the crown itself disappeared, and a 9th century since the family first arrived. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.